we would like to start to present the 6.1 item for the meeting of the Codex meeting in regard to the pesticide residues concerned with the MRLs proposed in the steps 4 and 7 that are initial adoption for the final adoption in the step 8 at the items of the Food Codex in November 2025. Now we can start by mentioning some references and related documents that we refer to analyze the 35th publication and the review of the pesticide residues when we have a need to refer back to any discussions of the mentioned pesticides, and mainly there is the monograph or pesticide GMPR for 2024, which is a big file, 400 pages, but it contains details of every pesticide separately, and there are comprehensive information and detailed data about that. As long as the main axis of this item, the proposals by the joint meeting for pesticide residues, I believe that it is important to provide some briefs about the team. It is an independent team of experts. Some of them belong to the Food and Agriculture Organization and WHO. They do assessment. They are the scientific arm who perform these assessments and analysis of the pesticides, and they provide the MRLs proposed, then adopted by the CCPR as the director of risks. Everyone knows that the slides, everyone knows that the assessment is based on the information provided by the sponsors or the manufacturers of pesticides themselves or the member states. In regard to the CEO panel of experts, they are for agricultural side. They receive the information in regard to the supervised trials or the experiments under supervision and the code agricultural practices, and based on this information and incomes, they propose the maximum rates, not only maximum rates, but also the supervised medians, which are the median of the residues of the experiments under observation. And there are several other values will be mentioned later. And the team under the WHO does one mission, which is very heavy, which is the assessment of the toxicity file of every pesticide, and to determine what is called of health-based gain values. These are the values based on the health considerations. And at the end, we believe the estimations, we need to keep them in the report of the GMPR. If they are in the reports, what are the MRLs? But also, we need to mention these reports that have the detailed information, especially the supervised median residues in regard to the commodities of the processed food and the highest residue. These are very important values that can be used later on to measure the dietary intake. The health-based guidance values include acceptable daily intake, and they are relied on to measure the exposure coming from consumption of this commodity, including the exposure of acute, shorter acute exposure, or the chronic exposure. This is just a quick brief on the diagram internally of the contents in general. Now we need to go through. Next slide, please. Now we show the more details of the item. Here I needed to make a comparison between the previous report when the tables are adopted and the priority lists and casual in 2024. We can find that it was approved and the schedule was closed, that we have 6 new pesticides and 8 reviews and a circular assessment based on the 15-year base or rule, and there are 17 assessments different starting from the previous reports and assessments, and increase in some commodities. When we resort back to the real report issued by GMPR in 2024, we can find there are 6 periodic reviews, only 6 new evaluations out of 8 approved. Then we can find a higher value of the new proposals, 25 new uses. There are several changes, but what are the reasons for these changes, if they are planned for? Next slide. Among the reasons in the report that we have,
لو سمحتوا نتمنى من الجميع إغلاق المايك.
Everyone please mute your microphones. Thank you. What are the reasons that there is difference? Sometimes we have pesticides, they are not without a proposed MRLs. Among the reasons, we can see that the data, and specific the data of toxicity, are not complete, especially here for the new compounds, but we can notice this mainly in the pesticides under the assessment of international review. Also, in sometimes referring back to the data available, especially in regard to chemical methods and those matters in regard to or relevant to the active material and substance and their table, we can find that the GMPR team is not able to give the residue definition. Residual definition, we know, is one of the most important steps in order to continue our work. The definition may be different in other places. No enforcement or annual commodity, blank commodity, and the dietary exposure, and so on, these technical matters. On another side, we have noticed this year that explicitly the GMPR wrote in regard to several pesticides that they don't have enough time, but or else they will not be followed by this meeting. That sends us to item number 44, which is the cooperative and collective work with the GMPR and the difficulties that are faced by the expert team of GMPR to benefit from all assessments that are programmed for next years. That was the same status for 4 pesticides. Next slide. Now for the pesticides that with MRLs, they are available and with alphabetical order. Next slide. We needed to focus that in regard to these matters like commodities. There are 4 pesticides proposed with MRLs. There are 4 commodities of rice. This is a very good matter for the countries that rely what can be produced, especially in regard to the pesticides, and there is a big number of the maximum rates proposed for the commodities of poultry and other commodities like cereals and so on. Next slide.
ثم أردت أنه أسلط الضوء أيضا. next slide please.
Next slide.
لا اللي قبلها. نعم شكرا. أردت أيضا فيما تبقى
Also,
من
I needed,
أنه أسلط الضوء على
in regard to the remaining of my PowerPoint, I needed to focus on two topics I found today in the report. When we read the tables coming from in the item 35, we need to get back to the report. We need to talk about the pesticides diluted in the oils or fats, and they believe the committee of pesticides needed to be an equivalence with the terms approved by the CCPR56, and for the other sentences in regard to mussels and milk fat and group of milk fats, poultry, for example, and avian. Based on that, this is a first part of the fat-soluble based pesticides. There is a change. So we will work with that, and the database will be harmonized. Next. Then there is a very fine detail which is very important, as long as in regard to the report what we talked about in the previous slide. The meeting directed that once there are more detailed pesticides for based on fats, we will propose MRLs for that. The GMPR for all of the fat-soluble pesticides, they resorted back to the studies based on which he proposed the MRLs. If the data based on the fats, they proposed MRLs others than the previous ones, and they propose MRLs for the charts separately for the meat or the muscle. The people in the laboratories know the differences over the years into this regard. Next slide. This is just an example for cyperonacazole. We notice in the table we had meat MN00, the line before the last one, 0095. It was disposed of and compensated with a new term. 0.01 was proposed with the same value. Next slide. The same matter for avian. The same in the top part of the table. We used to listen about poultry, now avian. Next slide. Here I needed to emphasize in regard to this pesticide, we can say why when they did this change, they didn't change the value for this pesticide. It is by chance the value 0.01 for quantification. It will not change by the change of this will not change nothing, but back to 0035, you will find that the meeting and GMPR proposed other values when they changed the values of the muscle, especially for fat-soluble pesticides. Next slide. These are the considerations that I needed to mention, which is the burden, food burden of cattle when there are a GMPR proposal of MRLs for plant food commodity for animal, they reassess the dietary burden of livestock, because the livestock is food for human in order for the statistics to be correct. So based or back to the guidelines and the criteria issued by OECD. Next. Consequently, we have classification under codex that mention any commodity or plant commodity is livestock food and any livestock. Here I took an example for Adofan Prox, the pesticide, and we can find in the next slide. We can find that the meeting this year, when they put for the rice commodities, the rice as cereal is a livestock food. So they took the calculation in 2011 and revised them and they made a recalculation based on these tables that we can find in the Annex 5 of the big report of the GMPR. And for more information or more details, we can share the OECD guidelines and discuss it in the CCPR to prepare for these matters. Then the last slide for me. Now back to the basis. There are proposals by the technical expert group. We will, as countries, we will give our opinions, but what should we rely on? We rely on several considerations, including technical considerations. For example, the legislation of the pesticides. The countries who adopt and approve several legislations. If the pesticide is not registered or prohibited in our country, and we can find that in the commodity imported, we can apply the LCLU, and even if the food codex put another value, we will not take this consideration for several other considerations. And there are other countries deal with the matter differently. They fully rely on the enforcement regard to the values taken from the CCPR, and they adopt them directly. There are also, in several times, some countries rely on the risk assessment and exposure assessment. In the process of confirming the values proposed by the food codex, they are in conformance with the food system and complying to the dietary exposure. And at the end, the national position is a national position that shall be taken into consideration, an assessment consideration, a risk management consideration, remaining just a position that boosts for every country their position of agriculture and food safety. I believe I reached the end of my presentation. Thank you. Peace be upon you.